Hello, and welcome to Glitterature Alley. I am Tootight Lautrec, the Master Mistress of Glitterature Alley, and here we are once again at the bottom of the down staircase in the permanently sequestered remainders section of an unnamed local library, which may or may not have two down and out lions lounging on the front steps, considering that everlasting existential question: what is it all about? And after reading this week's selection for Pulitzer who can blame them? Last week, we looked at a novel called Honey in the Horn, which won the 1936 Pulitzer Prize for the novel. And now we're going to skip over quite a few years because I have heard either of the books that were awarded the prize or the writers who wrote those books. So we're going to skip over 1937, which found Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind winning the prize. We'll skip over 1938, John Philip Marquand for the late George Apley. 1939, Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings for The Yearling. 1940, for John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath. And we'll skip over 1941, when no award was given. Although the rumor mill has it that Hemingway's For Whom the Bell Tolls was in high contention, but apparently the president of Columbia University at the time thought that it was too lascivious to give a prize to. There was a big kerfuffle, and in the end, no prize was given. And you can read more about that in James Rosenzweig's blog, which he calls Following Pulitzer, and I will link that below. But Tootight Lautrec, Master Mistress of Glitterature Alley and former drag laureate of the Sanitarium, you might ask, who did win the Pulitzer Prize in 1942? Well, thank you for asking. That would be a book and a writer with whom I am not familiar, In This Our Life by Ellen Glasgow, which apparently was also made into a movie directed by John Huston, starring Olivia de Havilland and Bette Davis. So double, triple doofus me for having never heard either of the writer, the book, or the movie. But be that as it may, before we get into In This Our Life by Ellen Glasgow, which won the 1942 Pulitzer Prize for novel, let's consider other books that were published in 1941, which were glossed over for the prize. And there are quite a few names that you'll no doubt be familiar with. Between Two Worlds by Upton Sinclair, Blood on the Forge by William Attaway, China Sky by Pearl S. Buck, The Colossus of Marusi by Henry Miller, The G-String Murders by Gypsy Rose Lee, which I have never read, but I really think I must. The Hills Beyond by Thomas Wolfe, Ida, a novel by Gertrude Stein, The Last Tycoon by F. Scott Fitzgerald, Mildred Pierce by James and M. Cain, The Real Life of Sebastian Knight, which is the first novel written in English by Vladimir Nabokov, Reflections in a Golden Eye by Carson McCullers, Saratoga Trunk by Edna Ferber, and The Wife of Martin Guerre by Janet Lewis. But the 1942 Pulitzer Prize for the novel goes to In This Our Life by Ellen Glasgow, which my copy looks like this. Ellen Glasgow was born April 22, 1873, and she lived until November 21st, 1945. She published many short stories and 20 novels. She was born in Richmond, Virginia. She was number 9 of 10 children, a rather sickly child. She was educated at home, but read deeply in philosophy, social theory, and British and European literature. In This Our Life explores the plight of a poor white family in the South in the early 1930s, and along with that, it also explores the blatant injustices of the African Americans who were their employees and also their friends. And this is how it begins. The street was darkened by a smoky sunset, and light had not yet come on in the lamps near the empty house. Under a troubled sky, the old house looked deserted, but charged with reality. It was a place, Asa Timberlake thought, where everything had happened and nothing would ever happen again. Its life, with so many changing lives, was finished. Already, he saw, the wreckers were at work on the white columns. Nothing would remain in the end. Not a brick, not a splinter of wood, not a tree, not a leaf, scarcely a blade of grass. For a new service station, flaunting a row of red pumps in front of a stucco arch, would presently spring up between the Georgian mansion and a Victorian dwelling in Lower Washington Street. So, this is Asa Timberlake watching his childhood home being demolished. His father was once the owner of one of the most prominent tobacco factories in Virginia, until it was taken over by robber barons from the north, and the family was plunged into poverty when Asa was just a young boy. Now, Asa works at a very low-paying job at the factory that his father used to own, and he is, by all accounts, a failure. Since this did happen when he was very young, at one point, thinking that he might rise on the social ladder, he married a woman named Lavinia, whose uncle was the wealthiest man in the town, who also happened to be ruthless and selfish, and so in the end it did Asa no good. He ended up marrying a woman that he didn't even like for nothing. They did, however, have 3 children, after which Lavinia took to her bed for good, and for some sort of undefined nervous disorder, which required that everybody around her wait on her hand and foot for the rest of her life. So they had 3 children. The first child was a son named Andrew, who is unremarkable in every way and appears almost nowhere else in the novel. And then they had 2 daughters, both of whom were named with boys' names for a reason that I can't quite fathom. But the oldest daughter is named Roy, and she is strong-willed and philosophically minded like her father, and she's happily married to a young doctor named Peter. And then the younger daughter is named Stanley, who is vain, selfish, manipulative, and she requires everyone's attention just like her mother, but in a very energetic way, almost sort of a manic way. And her defining characteristic is that she always wants what anybody else has. So, guess what Stanley wants, or who Stanley wants? 2 days before Stanley is supposed to be wed to a social-minded social justice lawyer named Craig, she runs away with Roy's husband, Peter. Drama ensues, and the rest of the book follows philosophical explorations grounded in concrete detail, but philosophical explorations about what we expect from life and from love and why we ever expect anything. Now, there is a subplot in which Asa's black housekeeper, Minerva, has a son named Perry who gets all sorts of scholarships all throughout high school and college, and he wants to become a lawyer. Asa wants to help him, but he's too poor to help. So everybody is hoping that somehow they can convince Lavinia's rich uncle to help pay for Perry to go off to law school. But that's a subplot. The main action is after Stanley runs off with Roy's husband Peter, the jilted lovers, Roy and Craig, slowly come together in their grief, and an initial tragic event brings Stanley home to the poor, crowded family home with Asa and Lavinia and Roy. And then a second major tragic event brings all the threads of the narrative together and all of the major characters together in a culmination that, well, you'll have to find out for yourselves. In the initial New York Times review, the book critic J. Donald Adams says, "The conviction which animated this book is that the only triumph over life lies in the refusal to accept defeat. Glasgow has, as an artist, consistently held the tragic view of life, even when the comic spirit glinted through her pages. But she never embraced the philosophy of despair." And I have to say that I feel that that is spot on for this novel. So, what kept me reading and what stopped me reading? Well, the little philosophical ruminations all throughout kept me reading because they were quite poignant and apt, and I did find them quite enjoyable. And I kept reading also to see what would become of the jilted lovers, Roy and Craig, and to see also just how manipulative Stanley could become. I also read to see if Asa, to see how he would get along, if he would find some source of inner strength at some point that will lift him up by his own bootstraps. And also to see how Asa's black friends would get along. So, as I said before, all the threads of this story come together really quite impressively. And so I was wondering about Asa's desire to be free of his wife and to live a happier life, Perry's desire to become a lawyer, Stanley's power over everyone in her manipulative way, and Roy's despair to see what would become of that, if it would subside or if it would grow. And I don't want to tip my hand to see if those were either thwarted or came to fruition. But as I said, one shattering moment brings it all together in a way that was not predictable and I found was really very well done. Qualms. Well, it started out a little slow, but it did get going. And as I said, the existential contemplations were interesting and satisfying. And if I did have another qualm, it would be that 580 pages is a lot of pages for a book. But this almost 600-page book read as if it were about a 300-page book. So I will give it props for that. Do I recommend? I do recommend it. I thought it was a good book. But there is another person reading all of the Pulitzer Prize winning novels, and he is called Great Books Guy. And he hated this book. So I will link his review of In This Our Life by Ellen Glasgow below, but beware, there are spoilers in his review. So if you don't like spoilers, don't read his review. But just to sort of balance out my review, you can read his to see how much he hates it. And it wasn't the top of my list, but I did quite like it. I thought it was quite good. And I would also argue that In This Our Life by Ellen Glasgow is not all about despair and depression, as the Great Books Guy seems to contend. I feel that her attention to detail, her exploration of life and love among the downtrodden, and her handling of the miseries of loss and the brevity of happy moments showed me as a reader that she is fully aware that in certain small moments, even in the midst of the travails in life, there is definitely wonder waiting to be noticed. And I will just say hooray for that. Hooray for wonder in all of its forms. Look around you, find yours, don't miss it, pay attention. I am Tootight Lautrec. Until we meet again. Mwah.